What's good? It's Wood. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Artur Beterbiev, 17 wins, 0 losses, defending his WBC and IBF light heavyweight titles, that's 175, defending those two belts against Joe Smith Jr., 28 wins and 3 losses, and Joe Smith Jr. will be defending his WBO light heavyweight title. So 3 of the 4 belts at light heavyweight are going to be up for grabs in this fight between Beterbiev and Joe Smith Jr. The other major belt holder in the division is Dmitry Bivol, who's holding the WBA belt, has defended it successfully several times, including his last fight against the pound-for-pound legend Canelo Alvarez, beating him via unanimous decision. And for some time, I say the past few years, it's been seen that the 2 best fighters at light heavyweight have pretty much been Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol. They just haven't locked horns yet. They haven't crossed paths, but they've pretty much been seen to be the 2 best light heavyweights in this. We'll call it the post Adonis Stevenson, Sergey Kovalev era in light heavyweight. Yes, Andre Ward did eventually come up from 168 and beat Sergey Kovalev, taking his shine and his belts and then retiring, but you can't really call it the Andre Ward era at light heavyweight because his presence in the division was pretty short. Like, he had fought, I think, Alexander Brand and Sullivan Barrera before fighting Sergey Kovalev twice, but there were several years where most of the boxing world wanted to see a showdown between the sensational talents at light heavyweight, being Adonis Stevenson and Sergey Kovalev. Both knockout artists, both very good boxers, both good athletes, slightly different styles and different promoters, which is ultimately the reason why that fight never took place. Very unfortunate, huge missed opportunity. I put that one up there with, like, Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua never having got in the ring. And I'm sure you guys could think of some others in terms of fights that really should have happened that never did happen. But in the wake of that, we've had Artur Beterbiev emerge as one of the best light heavyweights, as well as Dmitry Bivol, and for a moment, Alexander Gvozdyk, who eventually lost his belt, which he gained off of Adonis Stevenson, actually putting him in the hospital. Stevenson was in all types of health danger in the wake of Stevenson versus Gvozdyk. But that's how Alexander Gvozdyk won his belt and then lost it to Artur Beterbiev. And Beterbiev, he doesn't have a ton of fights on his record, 17-0, but all of his 17 wins have come via knockout. Now, he had one of those late starts to a professional career, relatively speaking. He's from Russia, the Dagestan region. For you MMA fans, that's the same region that Khabib Nurmagomedov and Islam Makhachev come from, Dagestan. That's where Artur Beterbiev is from, by way of Quebec, Canada. That's where he's taken residency over the past several years. And he has pretty much become one of the most destructive forces, pound for pound, in the sport. Again, all 17 of his wins came via knockout. And, even in his pre-professional career, he had successes beating the likes of Sergey Kovalev. He had beat him way back in the day. He actually lost twice in the World Boxing Championships in the quarterfinals to Alexander Usyk, the current WBA, IBF, and WBO heavyweight champion. Beterbiev actually lost in the amateurs twice to Usyk, but as a professional, undefeated, all via knockout, he was earning his stripes, basically beating lesser-known fighters like Gabriel Campillo. That was a significant 4th-round knockout for Beterbiev. In fact, he had kind of a hybrid uppercut hook that he throws that his trainers call the Campillo. So in Beterbiev's last fight against Marcus Brown, you could hear his corner saying, "Hey, hit him with the Campillo." And it was basically that hook uppercut hybrid. So he knocked Campillo out in the 4th round and then just put together a string of more knockouts. Enrico Colling being one of those victims, Callum Johnson being one of those victims. And Callum Johnson was actually about to fight Joe Smith Jr. just several months ago before they made this Beterbiev versus Joe Smith fight. It was supposed to be Joe Smith versus Callum Johnson, and Joe Smith was going to put his WBO light heavyweight title up for grabs. Callum Johnson ended up having to pull out of that fight because he tested positive for COVID-19 and he was replaced by Steve Geffrard. But yeah, Callum Johnson fought Artur Beterbiev. You know, I had actually done a Joe Smith Jr. versus Callum Johnson preview, and I thought that one was actually going to be pretty interesting. Callum Johnson is pretty damn heavy-handed, and when he fought Beterbiev, he actually dropped Artur Beterbiev before getting knocked out in the 4th round. So by this point, Artur Beterbiev had won a vacant IBF light heavyweight title against Enrico Colling. His first title defense of that was against Callum Johnson. And then he fought the Serbian Rade Kalajdzic. And then he beat him via 5th round knockout. And then it was after that Beterbiev fought the title unification fight against then WBC light heavyweight champ Alexander Gvozdyk. And this is in the wake of Gvozdyk again beating Adonis Stevenson, ending Stevenson's long reign as WBC light heavyweight champ. And that was a title that Adonis Stevenson had won by knocking out Chad Dawson. Sensational knockout. That was pretty much Adonis Stevenson's big coming out party. So Beterbiev fights Gvozdyk, the Teddy Atlas trained Alexander Gvozdyk, and it starts off pretty interesting. Gvozdyk is a pretty technical fighter, pretty traditional in terms of working behind the jab, kind of keeping an upright stance, and then putting your combinations together, moving pretty intelligently, laterally, and just doing all of the sweet science things that you would want to train somebody who's just learning the sport to be able to execute on. Gvozdyk was actually looking pretty decent against Beterbiev in the early rounds, but you could see slowly but surely the pressure, the intense and sustained pressure. It's not like a head over heels, Derek Chisora type of pressure. It's a patient hunter type of pressure where, you know, Beterbiev is kind of feigning his way in, jabbing his way in because he doesn't have a long reach. So he actually throws pretty short power punches, a lot of mid-range hooks. So he's not like Deontay Wilder trying to bomb you from the outside or like Boots Ennis or anything like that. He is trying to close the distance to get into shorter boxing range, not the phone booth, but just short of long range. So he's just inside of that, and he'll jab his way to get in a position to then throw power punches from that distance, that range that he likes to throw from. So Gvozdyk was trying to do everything he could, throw combinations, tie up. Listen to Teddy Atlas in the corner when he's telling you, do not let this guy close the distance on you, tie up if you have to. Don't forget to use your jab and move. Continue to move laterally. Keep this guy chasing you. Well, I mean, it's easier said than done when you've got Artur Beterbiev, who even in his mid-30s, he's in his late 30s now, but he was in his mid-30s in October 2019 when he fought Gvozdyk. Beterbiev was able to get into range more and more frequently to let his combinations go to where by the 7th, 8th round, you could see that it started to really take a toll on Alexander Gvozdyk. And then Beterbiev ended up stopping Gvozdyk via TKO in the 10th round. That was a big moment, biggest moment in Beterbiev's career, ends up becoming the unified champion. Now he holds the WBC and the IBF title. And Gvozdyk, in the wake of that fight, the loss to Beterbiev, Gvozdyk retires from the sport. And you can even hear to this day, Teddy Atlas, like, he speaks about that fight and about Gvozdyk somewhat emotionally. Like, Teddy Atlas really wanted his guy to win that fight. And they came in with the game plan. And Teddy Atlas sounds like he feels Gvozdyk might have left something on the table or is just kind of admitting that his guy Gvozdyk, it got broken, essentially, by Beterbiev in that showdown. So in the wake of that, COVID-19 hits. Beterbiev is out of the ring for like almost a year and a half. Returns to the ring in March in 2021 to fight Adam Dinas. And so he beats Dinas in the 10th round. A lot of people didn't think that Beterbiev looked great in that fight. Just like they didn't think Dmitry Bivol looked great in his two, post-COVID-19 fights against Craig Richards and then against Salimov, before then beating Canelo Alvarez. People thought that Bivol looked less than 100% performance-wise, and they kind of thought the same about Beterbiev when he fought Adam Dinas, but he did stop him in the 10th round. Beterbiev has never really been, he does have some early knockouts, but he's not the best fast starter. He basically starts slowly turning the temperature up round over round, where he's looking to break you by the middle and late rounds. Well, he eventually stopped Dinas in the 10th round, and then Beterbiev fights Marcus Brown, who at this point only had one loss. Marcus Brown had pretty much been a hot prospect for some time, kind of one of those contenders who's knocking on the door but isn't really fighting the best fighters that we want to see him fight. That was until Marcus Brown beat Bout Jack and then suffered his first professional loss against Jean Pascal, who actually just recently won a pretty good fight. Like, Jean Pascal, I mean, he's almost 40 years old, if not already 40 years old, and he's still looking pretty decent, even in the wake of his recent PED scandals. Well, Marcus Brown had one loss going into this fight with Artur Beterbiev. This is in December of 2021, and Marcus Brown looked pretty decent in the early rounds. He's got a long jab, he's a good mover, southpaw, so he's got a very tricky style, and it's hard to just collapse the pocket against the guy because he's pretty good at range control, ties up when he has to, and then he'll just keep you at the end of the jab. He'll kind of throw his 1-2 combinations and stay on the move. And so it was working with some success in the, again, early rounds against Beterbiev. They ended up clashing heads in the middle rounds to where Beterbiev's head was split so badly. I mean, they both got cut with this clash of heads, and it was basically because, you know, once Artur Beterbiev has you in range, Marcus Brown wanted to make it a point to tie up quickly. Don't let Beterbiev get some work done in closer quarters. You want to then reestablish the distance and then continue with your game plan. So one of the times Marcus Brown tried to jump in, he basically moved his head from one side to the other, and it brushed and basically banged into Beterbiev's head, split Beterbiev's head to where, you know, the ref was looking at the action, basically continuously threatening to only give Beterbiev one more round before he stops the fight. So being that Beterbiev didn't get off to the best start, now he's got this nasty cut on his head, which is just oozing blood. Like, he was a bloody mask for half of this fight against Marcus Brown. It kind of turned up the intensity and the urgency for Beterbiev to turn things around quickly. Not that he was demonstratively losing the fight. It's just that you could score a couple of those early rounds for Marcus Brown to where if they then stop the fight, like in the 6th or 7th round, Artur Beterbiev can conceivably lose the fight via, you know, technical decision. So he started to control the fight, started to keep Marcus Brown on the run, was able to find more and more opportunities to fight in the range that he likes to fight at. And again, he's not just walking in there. He is selectively feinting and jabbing his way into range. And he was able to have more and more success against Marcus Brown doing that, and then ends up breaking Marcus Brown down, especially to the body. Drops him to the body like in the 7th or I believe 8th round, and then finishes him in the 9th round. So by the end of this fight, you could tell Marcus Brown basically gave it everything he had, tried to survive for as long as he could. He tried changing his game plan and trying to make adjustments. I mean, he was trained in this fight by Derek James, Errol Spence Jr. and Jermell Charlo's trainer and Frank Martin's trainer. Well, Marcus Brown just didn't have enough on this night to beat, again, one of the most destructive forces in boxing, Artur Beterbiev. So that is his most recent fight. Again, another knockdown or knockout, 9th round knockout of Marcus Brown. And now he's about to fight the current WBO light heavyweight champion, Joe Smith Jr., who is pretty much just been one of those, and I don't want to be cliche because he's like a white American, and so a lot of people will just use the term blue collar to describe white Americans, especially from the Rust Belt regions of the United States. We're talking from like Ohio to, you know, upstate New York. So I don't want to be that cliche, but I mean, Joe Smith Jr. is literally a lumberjack. So he is cut from that, you know, Pittsburgh, Long Island, you know, Ohio type of cloth. You know, he's just a really tough dude. And he actually kept his job as a lumber cutter for much of his career. So he was basically working those two jobs. I mean, that almost sounds like, you know, 1950s, 1960s NBA players. You know what I mean? Well, Joe Smith Jr. had his first big opportunity against former title challenger Andres Fanfara. Very good fighter. We saw him beat, you know, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. We saw Fanfara fight a very good fight against prime champion Adonis Stevenson. They ended up having a rematch, and Stevenson had an easier time against Fanfara in the rematch. But when Joe Smith Jr. fought Andres Fanfara, Fanfara was a minus 1,300 going into this fight with Joe Smith Jr. Joe Smith Jr. was a plus 1,050, 1050. Huge underdog against Fonfara, ends up blowing him out, knocking him out in the first round, dropped him multiple times. The crowd was pretty stunned. This fight between Joe Smith Jr. and Fonfara took place in Chicago, Illinois. So, you know, if Fonfara is a Polish fighter, Chicago has a big Polish population. So this was actually supposed to be a pro-Fonfara crowd. Well, Joe Smith Jr. upset everybody in that stadium, knocking Fonfara out in the first round. So that was Joe Smith Jr.'s coming out party. And then in the wake of that upset victory over Fonfara, he fights the legend, the executioner turned alien, the nearly 50-year-old, no, he was 50 years old, Bernard Hopkins, multiple division champion. And, you know, Hopkins had recently lost to Sergey Kovalev, so he was well outside of his prime, but he was still able to beat other pretty good fighters in his late 40s. I've never seen somebody age as well, skillfully and performance-wise, in my history of watching the sport as Bernard Hopkins. It's been absolutely crazy to witness what he did well into his 40s, then into 50 years old. Well, that luck pretty much ran out because even the fights that Hopkins lost, like against Jermaine Taylor, against Chad Dawson, even against Sergey Kovalev, Hopkins made it the distance. Well, Joe Smith Jr. cracks he hits so damn hard. Not to say Sergey Kovalev doesn't. Sergey Kovalev was one of the 2 or 3 hardest punchers pound for pound in the sport for several years. But Joe Smith Jr. just applies sustained pressure. He was winning the rounds against Hopkins, and a lot of the veteran tricks that Hopkins likes to use, they weren't working with as much success against Joe Smith Jr. And by the 8th round, Joe Smith Jr. had Hopkins on the ropes way more than Hopkins should be on the ropes, and ended up landing a combination that sent Hopkins through the ropes and outside of the ring, upside down onto the, outside of the ring apron where, the fans and other people had to basically catch him. And it was really pretty tough to watch. Just having watched so much of Hopkins' career, it was hard to see Hopkins, the esteemed legend, go out basically looking like an exclamation point upside down outside of the ring against Joe Smith Jr. to where, that's how Joe Smith Jr. scored the knockout. And by the way, in that fight, Bernard Hopkins was a sizable favorite over Joe Smith Jr. Not nearly as sizable as Fonfara was, but Hopkins was a minus 165. Joe Smith Jr. was a plus 155. So there's been this theme in Joe Smith's career, especially, before now, where he is an underdog in this fight as well. But against Hopkins, he was an underdog, ends up knocking Hopkins out, and then he loses to Sullivan Barrera in a fight where he had his jaw broken. Sullivan Barrera, very good veteran, beat Joe Smith Jr. via unanimous decision. This was a 10-rounder, so this was a pretty big, significant setback for Joe Smith Jr. Then Joe Smith Jr. returns to the ring, knocks out Melvin Russell in the first round. Then he fights Dimitri Bivol. Bivol basically boxed Joe Smith Jr.'s ears off. I haven't seen anybody control Joe Smith Jr. quite this much, hitting him with combinations, using his footwork to dictate range and dictate the rhythm of the fight, where it was hard for Joe Smith Jr. to really consistently launch his offense. But he did, at one moment in this fight against Bivol, catch Bivol right as the end of the 10th round bell sounded, rock Bivol to where Bivol had to hold on to the rope to steady himself and then kind of stiffly walk back to the corner and then sit down. But you know what? People will often reference that moment, but Bivol recovered to the point where he won the 11th round and basically had Joe Smith Jr. in all types of trouble by the end of the 12th round, to where it looked like if that fight were to go another round or maybe even another minute or two, he looks like he might have been able to stop Joe Smith Jr. I don't know that to be the case, but look at how much Bivol is pouring it on by the end of the 12th round, and look at how much trouble Joe Smith Jr. was at the end of that fight. So Bivol, the guy who just beat Canelo, current WBA champion at light heavyweight, beat Joe Smith Jr. via unanimous decision. And then after that, Joe Smith Jr. beats Jesse Hart via split decision. That shouldn't have been a split decision. I had Joe Smith Jr. winning 9 rounds to 3, 8 rounds to 4, something like that. And by the way, Jesse Hart against Joe Smith Jr. was a sizable favorite. Jesse Hart was a minus 325. Joe Smith Jr. was a plus 305. So we're talking like a 3-1 underdog, 3-1 favorite being Jesse Hart, and Joe Smith Jr. ends up upsetting Jesse Hart in that case. Again, I don't think he should have been favored in that fight, and I damn sure don't think that was really, that should have been a split decision win for Joe Smith Jr. I thought it should have been unanimous. And that fight, by the way, you really see Joe Smith Jr.'s style. Yes, it does go the distance, but you see how uncomfortable opponents are because of the way that Joe Smith Jr. applies the pressure and the way that he just totally sells out when he's throwing his power punches. But his biggest step up, in my opinion, in terms of displaying skill and showcasing skill was against Eliezer Alvarez in August of 2020. So this is right in that COVID 2020 summer. Eliezer Alvarez was also a favorite against Joe Smith Jr. He was a -155 or -153. Joe Smith Jr. was a slight underdog against Eliezer Storm Alvarez. Eliezer Alvarez had stopped Sergey Kovalev after Kovalev, had gotten beaten by Andre Ward. Eliezer Alvarez beat Kovalev and then lost in the rematch to Kovalev, where it was kind of a new style of Kovalev, the one that works behind the jab and isn't really looking to finish you in the way that the crusher Kovalev used to. But Eliezer Alvarez fights Joe Smith Jr. It's a pretty even and technical fight. Eliezer Alvarez won a few of the earlier to middle rounds, but ends up getting knocked out in the 9th round. To me, even though Joe Smith Jr. has knocked out Bernard Hopkins, which you could argue is his best win, but I look at this fight against Eliezer Alvarez, who has also not returned to the ring. I think he retired after this fight and was talking about coming back, but I don't think Storm Alvarez has returned to the ring since getting knocked out by Joe Smith Jr. But this was a very good win because this was somebody who was seemed to be a better technical fighter than Joe Smith Jr. And Joe Smith Jr. actually started using the jab to start backing Eliezer Alvarez. I mean, he has used the jab a lot in the past, but his way of kind of feinting and then throwing the jab and just working on timing to then be able to get inside, to be able to let your lumberjack style power punches to the body and the head go. And he ends up again knocking Eliezer Alvarez out in the 9th round. And it was after that Joe Smith Jr. fights Maxim Vlasov for the vacant WBO light heavyweight title. And Maxim Vlasov gave Joe Smith Jr. hell in this fight. Look at Maxim. I really like Vlasov. And, he's 35 years old now, so I don't know how many more prime years he has. But his sweet science and technical ability and how good of an athlete he was in basically being able to box Joe Smith Jr.'s ears off in the early rounds. Like, Joe Smith Jr. looked like he was in trouble, like in the early and kind of in the middle rounds, where it looked like Vlasov was just boxing circles around him, where Joe Smith Jr. really had to pour it on late and really, really dig deep to pull this one off. And even in winning a majority decision win against Vlasov, like, this was a controversial win for Joe Smith Jr. A lot of people thought that Vlasov deserved the decision win. The judges had it 115-113 Joe Smith Jr., 115-112 Joe Smith Jr., and then 114-114 draw even. So this was a super close fight. I saw this one really could have gone either way because there were a few swing rounds. There were definitely a few rounds that you definitely had to give to Vlasov, and then only a couple rounds that you definitely had to give to Joe Smith Jr. Maybe I felt like there were more clear rounds for Vlasov than there were for Joe Smith Jr. So you had to give Joe Smith Jr. majority of the nearly even rounds for him to get the love and the edge on the scorecards. Super close fight against Maxim Vlasov. And then, he had that Callum Johnson setup fight, which, was canceled because Callum Johnson had COVID-19. Then he fights Steve Geffrard on short notice, ends up knocking him out in the 9th round and was winning most of the rounds on the way to scoring that 9th round knockout. But again, Joe Smith Jr. versus Maxim Vlasov, that fight is actually worth a rewatch. But now we have Artur Beterbiev versus Joe Smith Jr. for 3 of the 4 belts at light heavyweight. So how do I see this one playing out? Well, first off, the thing that's interesting about this matchup is that you look at Beterbiev's history. Where do you see him fighting a guy who's really trying to take the fight to him, who's front foot heavy and who's looking to come in and bang, not looking to move around the ring and box, not looking to, bide his time, keep moving, keep you at the end of the jab and survive the early rounds and nothing like that. When is the last time you've seen somebody who tries to pour it on with power punches? It's not Marcus Brown. It's not Gvozdyk. I guess that would be Callum Johnson, who again dropped Beterbiev in the early rounds before again getting knocked out in the fourth round. Same question I asked about Beterbiev, let's ask it about Joe Smith Jr. When is the last time Joe Smith Jr. has fought a guy who just tried to blow him out of the pocket, who tried to get into close but not quite phone booth, but closer than arm's reach boxing range and try to blow Joe Smith Jr. out? It wasn't Vlasov, it wasn't Storm Alvarez, wasn't Jesse Hart, damn sure wasn't Jesse Hart. Look at how deep Jesse Hart had to dig to survive against Joe Smith Jr. It wasn't Dmitry Bivol, as good as Bivol is, he's a technician in there and he uses angles, volume, accuracy, great legs and range control, footwork, all of those tools. It wasn't Sullivan Barrera, it wasn't Bernard Hopkins. I mean, it might have been Andres Fonfara, even though Fonfara is, a boxer puncher, and Fonfara probably had no idea that Joe Smith Jr. hit as hard as he does. So you'd really have to search for something that even emulates or nearly mimics the style of Artur Beterbiev. So in this fight, I was about to pick Joe Smith Jr. here because, okay, one, Beterbiev is like 37 years old now, right? So he's an aging fighter who isn't a fast starter to begin with. So he's an aging fighter who usually is able to slowly erode and break the opponent to where they start wilting by the middle and late rounds. How well does that go when you yourself start aging and your own durability or stamina, endurance, ability to start putting your foot on the gas in the middle to late rounds? How does that play out as you go into your late 30s? So I was thinking, damn, might we get a situation where Joe Smith Jr. not only beats Beterbiev, but might blow him out early, shocking much of the boxing world? I was about to go there, and it's a lesser possibility. It's not a probability, but it's a lesser possibility that can happen here because Joe Smith Jr. can devastate somebody in the first couple of rounds. Granted, in recent fights, they've either been late round knockouts or they've gone the distance, so he hasn't been blowing people out. Like his last first round knockout was against Melvin Russell in 2018, and then he knocked Fonfara out again in 2016. So most of his knockouts do come in the later rounds, but he does usually hurt his opponents pretty early. Again, rewatch Joe Smith Jr. versus Jesse Hart. So I was about to go there, but then I'm thinking, okay, Joe Smith Jr., when he himself is in trouble, because I'm gonna assume that Joe Smith Jr. isn't gonna knock Beterbiev out in the first couple rounds. So then, a pressure fight / boxing match might break out like by the third round to where Joe Smith Jr. will have to start getting on his improving, not elite, but improving jab, and is going to start looking for opportunities to throw hard shots, but he's also going to have to start minding his P's and Q's, defensively, because Artur Beterbiev is going to look to jab his way into range and to wreak havoc on Joe Smith Jr., both to the head and to the body. I'm looking out for a lot of body work here. Is Joe Smith Jr. going to be able to slow Beterbiev down by breaking him to the body? Or is Beterbiev going to be able to hurt Joe Smith Jr. to the body? I think that it would behoove both of these guys to do work to the body early and often, because for Joe Smith Jr., you've got an aging power puncher who's looking to break you down over the course of several rounds. The more you could beat him down to the body, the less durable and aggressive and destructive you could expect Beterbiev to be in the middle to late rounds. And if you're Beterbiev, you don't want this youngin, or relatively youngin, power puncher to be able to do the same in the middle rounds. So you want to break him down to the body. So I'm going to be looking for that. But I see more bad habits in Joe Smith Jr.'s defense than I do from Beterbiev. What I mean is, when Joe Smith Jr. starts getting backed up, whether it's by Maxime Vlasov or Dmitry Bivol or Sullivan Barrera, he does tend to turtle up a little bit. So he'll start to back up You know, not necessarily straight back, but he will back up straight back sometimes, which isn't good either. But even when he backs up at an angle, he basically does this, right? Artur Beterbiev is a master at getting into the range that he wants to get into and throw these hooks with both hands that have their way of getting around the guard. So when Joe Smith Jr. goes here, I expect Beterbiev's hooks to be able to go around that guard and bang right into his chin, and also for Beterbiev to use those moments when he's got Joe Smith Jr. backing up to either go with those hooks around the guard, uppercuts through the guard, or just tag him to the body and make that moment count in that way. So because I don't see Joe Smith Jr. getting an early knockout of Beterbiev, again, it's possible, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think that it's more likely, even at 37 years old, that Beterbiev uses those vulnerabilities, those defensive vulnerabilities for Joe Smith Jr., because both of these guys get hit, but Joe Smith Jr., I see more bad defensive habits than I do for Beterbiev, and I see Beterbiev when we get to the middle rounds, depending on how these first few rounds go, as being able to hurt Joe Smith Jr. in those moments of vulnerability. Again, I expect a ton of fireworks in this fight, and it's going to be really interesting because if Joe Smith Jr. is able to start hurting Beterbiev in the middle rounds, where Joe Smith Jr. is able to start pouring it on and getting the older destructive force to wilt, that would be a sight to see. I'm having visions of Joe Smith Jr. against Bivol. Again, Beterbiev, very different style than Bivol. Beterbiev, very different style than Vlasov. But I'm picturing those fights and how Joe Smith Jr., even in the late rounds, was unable to get the knockout and was showing a lot of moments of showing those bad habits when he started to get backed up. I just think that Beterbiev is too destructive of a force to not take advantage of those opportunities. So, again, this is a very fun matchup, and either one of these guys can potentially knock the other one out, but I just see the more likely scenario that we get Beterbiev to not only beat Joe Smith Jr., but to stop him in the late rounds. Whew, I was this close. I was really this close to going Joe Smith Jr. via stoppage, like basically saying this is where the young lion finally eats the old lion. I mean, we saw it with Gvozdyk versus Adonis Stevenson, and I was about to go with Joe Smith Jr. pulling off the upset against Beterbiev. In this fight, by the way, Beterbiev is a minus 714, like basically a 7-1 favorite against Joe Smith Jr. I think that that's way out of whack. I might put a little bit of money on Joe Smith Jr. just because he is a 7-1 underdog against Beterbiev. Again, I'm expecting fireworks here. Damn, that's a lopsided. I didn't expect the odds to be that lopsided. That is, once again, a lot of disrespect for Joe Smith Jr., who really seems to thrive on that disrespect. So don't be totally surprised if Joe Smith Jr. ends up beating or even stopping Beterbiev, but I'm going to take Beterbiev via late stoppage because, again, of those defensive liabilities when Joe Smith Jr. is not on his front foot and then starts getting backed up, because we will see an ebb and flow in who's backing up who. By the way, if we start seeing Joe Smith Jr. look tentative and look like he's trying to Marcus Brown his way into moving around and working behind a jab and buying time and tying up and doing all of that, if we see Joe Smith Jr. doing a lot of that, that's usually a bad sign. Unless Joe Smith Jr. is totally trying to flip the script style-wise and in terms of what his game plan is versus Beterbiev, I just think it's more likely that we see Joe Smith Jr. fight a Joe Smith Jr. or try to fight a Joe Smith Jr. style of fight against Beterbiev. I just think that it's going to be Joe Smith Jr. who eventually wilts and gets hurt and then stopped by Beterbiev. But yeah, let me know what you think about this showdown for 3 of the 4 belts at light heavyweight. And do you think that the winner of this fight ends up doing some sort of a cross-promotional fight to fight Dimitri Bivol, who Canelo Alvarez isn't going to be fighting in the immediate future since he's going to be fighting Triple G for a 3rd time? Might we get a title battle for undisputed between the winner of Beterbiev and Joe Smith Jr. versus Dimitri Bivol? if we get something like Bivol versus Beterbiev, I can't wait to really analyze and watch that fight. I mean, that's going to be very, very interesting. But again, that's assuming that Beterbiev gets past Joe Smith Jr. and that Dimitri Bivol beats whoever he eventually fights next. We'll stay tuned and see what happens there. But let me know what you think about Beterbiev versus Joe Smith Jr. in the comments. And please, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.